Thank you for being here. My name is Anita Thompson. I'm the chair of the Nelson Institute Water Resources Management Program. And this graduate program is a professional master's. And at the core of the curriculum is this interdisciplinary practicum. And students work as a cohort, as a team to address a contemporary water resource challenge. So it's a intensive 18+ month endeavor. And so I just want to congratulate all the students for reaching this milestone. This is really exciting. I know how much work goes into this. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So with that, I'll turn it back to Eric. Eric is the advisor for this project, this practicum. And Eric, on behalf of the WORM program and the Nelson Institute, I just want to thank you for all of your efforts working with this team and taking the lead on this project. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thanks, Anita, and welcome everyone, those within and outside UW, and especially those tuning in from the Coon Creek region. We really appreciate you all being here. My name is Eric Booth. I'm an associate scientist in the departments of agronomy and also affiliated with civil and environmental engineering in the Nelson Institute here on campus. And just want to set the stage briefly before I hand things over. And I will admit that I'm going to read this because I want to try and be as efficient as possible so that we can get to the main event. So I've had the pleasure of serving as the lead advisor to this 2020 WRM cohort since early 2019. And as lead advisor, one of the most consequential decisions that I had to make was the project topic. At the time, I was working on some research on a few streams in the Kickapoo watershed. And so I was very aware of the record flooding that took place in 2018 and the increase in the frequency of major floods in the last 10 to 15 years in that region. But it wasn't until I heard Bob McKeel, who is the director of the Monroe County Land Conservation Department, give a talk in February 2019 about the 5 dam breaches that occurred in the Coon Creek and the adjacent West Fork Kickapoo watersheds, that I knew this was the right topic to choose. It was clear from Bob that the community was at a crossroads and grappling with this question of how to respond following such devastation. After some initial discussion with Bob, I also discovered that the Natural Resources Conservation Service and La Crosse, Monroe, and Vernon counties were going to be working on a watershed planning project in response to the dam breaches that would include some flood modeling and economic analyses to assess various options moving forward with the community guiding that evaluation process. And so I saw some clear momentum gathering, and the question for me was how best can I leverage the resources of the university to help while also creating a rich educational experience for the students. So at that point, I really benefited from a project co-led by my colleague, Caroline Gottschalk-Druschke in the English department and her collaborators with the Driftless Writing Center called Stories from the Flood, which I can pop a link to in the chat. If you're not familiar with this project, they were able to gather over 70 oral histories from people deeply impacted by the 2018 floods. And a few big takeaways from that for me was flooding is and remains a really difficult and traumatic topic in the region. We know that too many people still actually get physically ill when they hear that heavy rainfall is in the forecast. Also, just the incredible stories of heroism, neighbors helping neighbors that reveal a strong social fabric in the region. And finally, enhancing flood resilience, even with those community strengths, is just a really big challenge, especially in an under-resourced rural area within a beautiful but very steep and often violent landscape. So what is the role of UW-Madison and groups like the WRM program in this challenge? Well, I would offer a few ideas. First, I think we can help support a process that helps the community decide how it wants to move forward by listening, facilitating discussions, analyzing and integrating what we hear and observe, and providing useful information. Second, and related to that, we can help by filling research gaps. And while I admit that research can often be painfully slow and not provide immediate action on the ground, there are still a lot of open questions related to things like hydrology and social science that can inform long-term strategies. And that is what these WRM students have been tasked with. And third, we can commit to getting these results into the hands of policy and decision makers so that those community-driven strategies can be properly resourced and enacted on the ground. So personally, that is my long-term commitment as this WRM project finishes up this summer and we roll out a report and hopefully get a chance to discuss it in person with some of you. And I will start to weave the lessons learned together with other projects ongoing in the region, such as the Grassland 2.0 project, which some of you are aware of. And it's focused on adoption of grassland agriculture and managed grazing in the upper Midwest, as well as a new National Science Foundation funded project that I'm working on and is focused on flood resilience and stream restoration. And we'll be expanding on the flood models that are being developed as part of that NRCS-led watershed planning effort. So it's a lot to coordinate and keep track of in the region. And I know this level of research attention can often be overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time for the community members involved. But the commitment that I share with many of my UW colleagues is to help transform this research into meaningful, community-driven, positive change on the ground as much as possible with the resources and influence we have available. Because I believe that this is kind of an all hands on deck kind of moment for the region. So let me pivot towards the students really quick before I introduce them. As we are all well aware, this past year has been really tough due to the pandemic. While the students really planned to and wanted to engage face-to-face with the Coon Creek community as much as possible, the pandemic really limited that experience, unfortunately. But given those limitations, they did an incredible job of immersing themselves into a really complicated topic that set them working across multiple disciplines and getting to know the community as much as they could with virtual interviews and even a few weeks of socially distanced field work last summer, all while living with the stress, uncertainty, and isolation associated with the pandemic. So they've been an amazing group to watch, and I'm very happy to introduce them now. They are Rajpreet Grewal, Catherine Herlihy, Jackson Parr, Robert Rosner, Rachel Sodeman, and Kayla Wansnyder. And this presentation represents kind of their current draft of a final report that is slated for completion in a few months. So there's still time for feedback from anyone willing to provide it. And I would just say for the format of today's seminar, please use the chat function in Zoom to ask any questions throughout the talk. And I will do my best to moderate them at the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Raj.
Perfect, thanks, Eric. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so as Eric said, our cohort focused on flood resilience in the Coon Creek watershed. This was done with support from the County of La Crosse, Monroe County, and Vernon County, funded by La Crosse and Monroe County. So to begin with a little bit of a background on the watershed itself, the Coon Creek watershed is a 90,000 acre watershed in southwestern Wisconsin, shown on the map outlined in blue, and spans Vernon, Monroe, and La Crosse counties. It is part of the driftless region, meaning it was never covered by the glaciers, which produced a rolling landscape with low valleys, steep slopes, and high ridges. In the 19th and 20th century, there was a shift in land use from mainly prairie and forest to cropland and pasture, which included land and tree clearing on hill slopes, compaction of soils from livestock, and other changes. Overall, this reduced the infiltration capacity of the area, therefore allowing more rainfall to flow into the valley, contributing to severe flooding and erosion. To tackle this erosion in the 20th century, the United States Erosion Service began the first watershed demonstration project. This brought in the Civilian Conservation Corps to construct infrastructure such as terraces and grassed waterways. Other projects included reforesting hill slopes and implementing soil conservation measures such as contour strips, which are shown in the photograph. Although the project ended in 1940, many of these measures are still in place today. This did help reduce flooding and erosion in the area, with research from Trimble showing at least a 75% reduction in erosion in the watershed between 1934 and 1982. The figure on the right, adapted from Trimble, are modeled estimates that show how the expected flood size associated with a 5-inch 24-hour rainfall event has changed over time as the land changed. In the figure, we see the initial sharp increase right here in discharge as the natural forest and prairie was converted into cropland. After soil conservation measures begin, we see a decrease in runoff and peak flow. However, repeat floods encouraged the construction of a series of dams in the area between 1960 and 1965. Additionally, since the 1980s, there has been a decline in the agricultural conservation practices mentioned previously. So moving on to the long-term flood trends and climate change impacts. The graph on the left shows the long-term trends in the region using data from neighboring Kickapoo River at Lafarge. We saw relatively large floods in the 1950s and 1960s declining due to the conservation practices, and then a stark rise in extreme floods since 2008 as a consequence of climate change and perhaps some land use changes. The graph in the middle, using rain gauge data from the La Crosse Airport, illustrates the growing number of days with 1 inch or more of rainfall. The severity and frequency of heavy rainfall has been rising over the past few decades when compared to the 20th century, resulting in an increase in the 100-year and 500-year rainfall events. This is primarily driven by climate change and is only predicted to continue. The last graph on the right from Villarini et al. Analyzes the projected changes of daily rainfall distribution in the future, with results projecting an increase in extreme rainfall over the northern US, including Wisconsin, outlined here. A recent disastrous flood, which severely impacted the community, was the August 2018 flood event. This was a very traumatic event with impacts still being felt in the community today. As seen from the map from the National Weather Service, the watershed saw around 10 to 15 inches of total rainfall. This heavy rainfall and intense flooding caused mudslides, washouts, and road closures. There were emergency evacuations in Coon Valley, Cashin, and other local areas. 3 dams breached and 2 overtopped. The picture on the right shows one of these breached dams where a wall of water broke through and rushed down the valley. After events like this and others, the community grapples with what to do next to help deal with floods. As Eric mentioned, this has led to many collaborative efforts, one of which is an ongoing watershed planning project led by the NRCS and the 3 counties, targeted to the Coon Creek watershed and the Westport Kickapoo watershed, which is immediately to the east. Our project complements this and expands the focus on flooding. So to reiterate, we are focusing on how to increase flood resilience in the watershed. There are various ways to approach this concept of resiliency. So for the purposes of our project, resilience is the ability of a system to prepare for threats, absorb impacts, recover, and adapt following persistent stress or a disruptive event. This definition is taken from an article by Marchese et al. 2018. The following groups contribute to this holistic understanding of flood resilience. Additionally, this cohort's aim is to be actionably helpful to the counties. This goal steered the direction of our research topics, which we divided into 5 categories: infiltration and land use, economics of land use practices, public perspectives, flood management institutions, and community resilience. Next, Rachel will be talking about our infiltration and land use group.
Thanks, Raj. So, like Raj mentioned, one of our goals was to find ways to increase infiltration on the watershed's landscape, which would help reduce and slow the flow of runoff that causes flood events. To do so, we reviewed historic and current trends in land use and land management in the watershed and investigated the effects of those practices have on infiltration. Then we analyzed recent changes in contour strip cropping and also determined the effects that change and other land use changes had on the watershed's storm runoff response and flood peaks. Finally, we included a small section on the economic benefits and consequences of land use and land management changes. So first, we want to consider Coon Creek's landscape. As Raj mentioned in the introduction, the driftless area has a unique topography with rolling ridges, steep hill slopes, narrow valleys, and this topography plays a role in runoff generation. So when a rain event occurs, all of the water from that rain event goes into Coon Creek. The ridges in the area are made up of silt and clay, which have high runoff potentials and low infiltration rates, so it's not really receptive to rain and ultimately causes runoff. This runoff then drains onto the steep forested hill slopes, which are covered by a thin layer of soil above fractured bedrock, and that allows for higher infiltration rates. but the hill slope steepness moves water quickly into the valley bottoms, limiting their infiltration potential. Infiltration rates in the watershed's valley bottoms are generally low, and overland flow quickly enters the stream channel. Thus, the physiographic makeup of the watershed makes it prone to flooding and flooding due to low infiltration potential and high runoff. So in the watershed, infiltration rates are inversely related to land use intensity, meaning forests have high infiltration rates while cropland have lower infiltration rates. The combined effect of land management practices such as cover crops, contour strip cropping, perennial cropping systems, no-till, and buffer strips can all help increase infiltration. In the images, you see a few examples of these. Contour strips are implemented in the watershed by the Conservation Project and remain a prominent part of the watershed and show how strips of crops that are planted in line with the landscape contours help to prevent erosion. Waterways are also part of these contour strips and sit between the rows and help collect and infiltrate cropland runoff. Cover crops provide seasonal cover and help improve soil health and infiltration, but really aren't commonly used throughout the watershed. So after reviewing these effects, our next step was to directly measure infiltration rates in the watershed. And so to do so, we narrowed our scope to the Rollins Coulee in the headwaters of the watershed, which was the site of 2 of the dam failures in 2018. We selected 3 sites on the ridge, which you can see in the figure on the right, with varying land uses of pasture, cropland, and fallow field, and varying land management practices, and conducted infiltration measurements. For each measurements, we used a double ring infiltrometer pictured on the left, which is filled with water to mimic standard saturation conditions of a rain event. And we measure the amount of time it takes for a ½ inch drop in water level until we get a constant rate. It's quite a timely process, but after about 18 measurements throughout the summer, we got to be experts at it. And so on the next slide, we see the results of those measurements. In the first figure, we're simply comparing the range of infiltration rates for each land type. So corn, alfalfa, waterway, pasture, and fallow field. And we see that grass waterways promote high infiltration rates while the rest of the land uses are relatively lower. It's also encouraging that 80 to 85-year-old waterways and contour strips from the watershed demo project are still functional and help increase infiltration. In the next figure, we're comparing infiltration between annual crops, so corn and alfalfa, and perennial land covers like pastures, waterways, and fallow fields. We found that perennial cover has a significantly higher infiltration rate than annual cover. And this is supported by our previous point that perennial cropping systems increase infiltration. So now I'll pass it off to Robert to talk about some additional infiltration analyses.
Thanks, Rachel. So now as Rachel talked about that, we have an idea of the effect of land use and land management in the watershed. We're looking now to track how changes in land management and land use impact infiltration, runoff volume, and flood peaks. So first, we analyzed the change in contour strip cropping from 2004 to 2018 in the Rollins subwatershed, as contour strips are easy practices to identify from aerial photos and then digitize and find the area of in GIS. So in the image, you see that change over that time, where there was about a loss of 536 acres of contour strips in the Rollins subwatershed. This loss may reduce the infiltration capacity of the subwatershed. As we've noted, contour strips help improve infiltration. However, really just looking at contour strips is an incomplete picture of tracking runoff responses. Other variables such as other land use or land management changes could be going on and affect runoff response in the watershed. So on the next slide, we also used a curve number analysis to kind of supplement that change and provide a more complete picture of runoff response in the watershed. So curve number is a parameter that measures the runoff response on a watershed and is dependent on land use, land management, hydraulic condition, and soil conditions. It typically ranges from 0 to 100, where a higher curve number means more response and vice versa. So you can see an example of this with the first image that shows how an increased curve number leads to more runoff. And then the second is showing just the factors that are used to determine curve number for a given land cover. For the specific analysis in GIS, I won't get into the minute details, but we use the NRCS cropland data layer, the NRCS Surgo soil survey, and our digitized contour strip layer as data sets to use as parameters for determining curve number in the watershed. So next, let's look at our curve number results. So we decided to calculate curve number for the entire subwatershed and its ridge, and we see an increase in curve number on the ridge between 2004 and 2018. which leads to greater runoff on the ridge. However, we saw a little change in curve number for the sub-watershed as a whole. We also use the SDS curve number method to determine the peak discharge for the 25, 50, and 100-year floods for a 6-hour and 24-hour storm. And while we see a little difference between peak discharge or runoff volume between the 2 years, the storm of the 2018 flood event that Raj mentioned and of course is the catalyst for this project, was about 100 to 500-year flood. So it does give you an idea of the amount of runoff that storm and these other storms generates. So the next thing we looked at with the curve number method is the effective time of concentration has on runoff and flood response. So time of concentration is the time it takes for water to flow from the hydraulically most remote point in a watershed to its outlet. So in this way, a quicker time of concentration leads to a higher flood peak. And this was illustrated in the watershed prior by Trimble with a review of peak discharges to a model 25-year, 24-hour flood in the neighboring Timber Coulee watershed. So Trimble noted how conversion to cropland prior to those soil conservation measures in the 30s really increased flood peaks, in large part due to cropland generating more rapid runoff and having a reduced time of concentration. However, the graph also shows that following those flood peaks, after conservation practices were implemented, those flood peaks decreased due to an increased time of concentration that allowed for more infiltration and slowing the flow of runoff. So we did something similar with the figure at the right with the 2018 25-year, 24-hour flood that we had previously simulated with the curve number method, where we increased the time of concentration synthetically and illustrated how this increase led to a lower flood peak with a slower runoff rate. So this projected time of concentration increase can be achieved in the watershed with effective land management and land use changes that promote infiltration, reduce and slow runoff, and reduce flood peaks. So now that we've kind of discussed our results, let's take a look at our recommendations for this group. So our first recommendation is to work to restore and maintain contour strips and grass waterways in the watershed, given the beneficial impact both the results and literature review has shown that these practices have in increasing infiltration on the watershed's ridges. However, in recent years, there has been a move away from contour strips in the watershed, as shown in a small scale with our GIS analysis, and then also just anecdotally from conversations with stakeholders. So this restoration can be accomplished through a variety of policy initiatives, such as educational outreach, voluntary incentive program, or a producer pays approach. And these approaches will be discussed a little further in our final report. Our second recommendation is to promote and implement perennial pasture in the watershed. So again, our results in literature review also showed that perennial land cover had higher infiltration rates than annual land cover. So, however, in the watershed and across Wisconsin, annual crops are more often used as feed, in the dairy industry, while perennial alfalfa or seeded pasture are also viable options. So really a move to perennial pasture would help reduce runoff in the watershed. And then finally, our third recommendation is to work to provide more funding for technical staff to help farmers install these management practices. So this funding would obviously progress those previous two recommendations and work to help create a watershed-wide climate that embraces and implements management practices and works to reduce runoff. Obviously, this watershed already has a rich history of that, but all of these recommendations really do require more funding, additional staff, and technical assistance to support the local county staff and NRCS staff that are tasked with implementing practices and land use changes and helping farmers do that. So in the next section, Jackson will discuss the economics of implementing some of these proposed land management practices.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, so I'll be talking here about the economics of land use practices and then move us into our public perspective section. When thinking about economics, our goal is to quantify the private costs associated with best management practices to identify opportunities to incentivize implementation. It would be great if we could just ask all producers to install grassed waterways and contour strips, but there are real private costs associated with doing so. So how do we do this? We identify the costs and benefits associated with contour strip cropping, cover cropping, and managed grazing. So 3 practices that we feel could help improve infiltration outcomes in the region. And then we conducted what's called a Monte Carlo simulation to account for the uncertainty in cost parameters. So what that is we drew 10,000 different random draws from these cost parameters and then average them out to determine the probable cost for implementation of each practice. Next slide, Raj. So before we get into the Monte Carlo simulation, just looking a little bit more broadly at economic impacts related to agriculture in the region. So best management practices require participation of private landowners, but they face many different economic limitations. So this quote here from one of our watershed managers that we interviewed for this research suggests that there's been a decline in dairy in the region, and that's being replaced with cash cropping, corn, soybean. The figure on your left, you see almost kind of an incredible one-for-one decline in the number of milk cows and the hay acreage. So hay, alfalfa, generally complementary to the dairy industry. So we would expect to see that decline follow each other. But that decline and increase in corn and soy may reduce the infiltration capacity on the landscape. So the next slide shows another way to look at land use in the region. This is taken from the Census of Agriculture going back to 1925. And this is for Vernon County, which we used as kind of a proxy for the watershed. And here we've split up kind of three categories that I'd like to talk about. The green is different varieties of pasture. Yellow is hay and alfalfa. And then the blue at the bottom is soybean and corn. So a few things to think about here. We've seen this gradual decrease in the number of pasture acres in the watershed, really since the 1930s. And then we see this alfalfa kind of grow throughout the 20th century, but now it's starting to tail off again. And probably the most striking thing is the near explosion of corn and soybean acres in the watershed. So making up less than 10% of the planted acres back in the 1920s, corn and soy now accounts for nearly 40% of acreage in the watershed. Specifically of note, soybean was virtually non-existent in the watershed until around the 1980s, and now it makes up nearly 15% of the land acres. So there's some kind of changes on the landscape that are being influenced by more macroeconomic trends. So now we'll look at the Monte Carlo simulations for our three land management practices. First one, looking at contour strip cropping. So here our costs include surveying, seed, and the opportunity cost of the land. And we see an average cost of about $236 per acre to implement contour strips. So to maybe put this in a little more concrete example, Rachel and Robert talked about the loss of contour strips, about 536 acres over the last 15 or so years. Let's say we wanted to put all those back. We're looking at approximately $125,000 in costs to do so. So this strip cropping model assumes that there are no benefits, no private benefits to the landowner. Looking at the next slide and thinking about cover cropping. Our costs with cover cropping include seed, planting, and termination benefits. There are some possible potential for benefits to the private landowner by way of increased yield, fertilizer savings, herbicide savings. We discounted those benefits pretty significantly, so this should be viewed as a very conservative estimate. And we see that average cost to put a cover crop program in at $135 per acre, and that's over a 5-year time horizon, discounted back to present value. But one encouraging thing, we see that range almost gets us to the point where it's net profitable to implement a cover cropping program. Cover crops are not super common in the watershed, but this kind of provides one example as to look at ways in which we might incentivize that as to be more popular going forward into the future. So our last Monte Carlo simulation here, looking at managed grazing, pretty high upfront costs related to managed grazing. And those costs include labor, fence materials, seed cost, and equipment cost. So we're looking at approximately $3,000 to institute a managed grazing program on a 2.5 acre parcel. And importantly, this model here does not assume any benefits to the private landowner, but literature does show that there can be very substantial benefits to the private producer. There are lower costs per cow, higher net farm operating income over a period of time. The Grasslands 2.0 project that Eric mentioned at the outset is looking at these managed grazing practices, see how we might be able to get more of that on the landscape in Wisconsin. So now wrapping up, just a few thoughts about the economics of land use practices. So what is the baseline? We want to think about, if you're turning a fallow field to contour strips, you might have some higher costs, whereas maybe some of those acres that we lost to contour strips over the last 15 years, bringing them back might be a lower cost. So the private producer should think about where they might be as far as those different cost parameters and instituting them. We also want to think about private versus public costs and benefits. So importantly, these models do not include any public costs or benefits. As we can see here, there's been some infrastructure damage related to flooding in the region. We might think that if the damage to public infrastructure exceeds the costs to implement some of these practices, we might think about using some public dollars to invest in the implementation of these best management practices in order to reduce higher costs to the public as a whole. We did see in the 3 simulations that each land management practice does require cost, at least up front. And those costs create a barrier to participation. So it's unlikely that any producer would participate in a practice that is only going to cost them money, which suggests that we might need to think about subsidization, cost share programs. There are existing cost share programs in the state, but they're generally underfunded and require more resources to incentivize participation from private landowners. So now I'm going to roll us right into our public perspectives section. So our goal with this was to identify opinions on flood management in both watershed managers and the general public, and also gauge flood risk perception, responsibilities, and experience. So this consisted of 26 interviews with residents, public officials, and what we call them watershed managers, or those who have some kind of professional capacity related to the watershed. So moving to the next slide. Before we get into those interviews, just a kind of brief overview on some top-level demographics of the watershed to understand who the public are. So we see the Coon Creek, West Fort Kickapoo, and Wisconsin as a whole, just kind of as a way to think about these demographics as relative to one another. Residents of the Coon Creek watershed tend to be a little bit older, have slightly higher median household income. Interestingly, they're a much higher percentage of owner-occupied housing units, so not a lot of renters in the Coon Creek watershed compared to those 2 other geographies, which might come into play when we start thinking about community resilience and kind of an ownership or feeling of agency over a place that you live. And then one interesting note is the percentage of homes that have insurance for earthquake or flood, likely in this case flood. About 3% in the Coon Creek watershed, slightly lower than the West Fort Kickapoo, but right around there for Wisconsin. So now thinking about the households that are within the 100-year floodplain, they're by and large older. So about 40% of the households in the 100-year floodplain were built before 1960. Could be encouraging that people are choosing not to locate their homes that they're building these days in the 100-year floodplain. Looking at income, we really don't see any kind of pattern. So there's no relationship really between income level and residents within the 100-year floodplain. So now looking at the literature related to the public's experience and perceptions of flood events. So flood risk and willingness to pay higher mitigation costs is associated with past flood experience and proximity to a hazard. So that might be a little bit intuitive. If I've been flooded in the past, or if I live next to a river, I'm a little bit more aware of the potential of flooding, and I might support higher mitigation costs to prevent that from happening to me. We also see the presence of a moral hazard, or the occasion where a reduction in some type of risk actually results in higher risk behaviors. So the National Flood Insurance Program, dams can be considered one of these, where if I feel like I'm being protected by a dam or financially through flood insurance, I might not take as many actions to reduce my own risk. People also support greater flood mitigation projects if they trust their government to execute them well. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the institutions section. And then flood protection is a government function and not a private individual's responsibility. And we see some interesting differences here as we get into our interviews with the residents and watershed managers in the Coon Creek watershed. So now looking at some of those interviews, we conducted a thematic analysis of the 26 transcripts that we compiled, and we identified 9 themes that seem to weave their way through all of the transcripts. One of those being spatial influence. So there is a difference between those who live in the valley and those who live on the ridge, and the way in which they experience flooding, which might make sense. Those in the valley are more likely to be acutely affected by flood events. Climate change is another theme that came through in our interviews, a politically sensitive topic in the region. And interestingly, we had a greater proportion of what we considered watershed managers attributed a lot of the recent extreme weather events to climate change, whereas a lower proportion of residents and public officials, publicly elected officials, attributed climate change, attributed the flood events to climate change. The role of experience. So this is a really telling quote to me. When you go through 3 or 4 floods in 3 years, that's what really helps. People who experience floods know how to navigate them better than those who don't experience floods. Ideally, what we're trying to do here is make it so that you don't have to get flooded to understand how to navigate through a flood. But that role of experience is really important, especially when we start thinking about municipalities participating in programs like FEMA's disaster funds. Also, trauma and emotional toll. So we heard some pretty harrowing stories about particularly that August 2018 flood event. And there's really a desire for people to express what happened to them and have their trauma and emotional toll be considered in the decision-making process. So moving on to a couple more themes here, the distribution of resources. So a lot of municipalities, particularly in the Coon Creek watershed, and the counties simply don't have the resources to adequately adapt to and respond to flood events in a way that perhaps they would like to. Thinking about the distribution of responsibility. So this is where we saw a little bit difference from the literature that we found. There's really this feeling of collective action in the watershed. Everyone feels like they are in part responsible and should be taking an active role in increasing flood resiliency in the region. So then we also identified flood insurance, heritage and history, and community as a few other themes that we'll flush out more fully in the written report to come. So a few takeaways looking at our public perspective section. Flooding affects residents in different ways, and they should not be viewed as a heterogeneous group. And people attribute the cause of flooding to a wide variety of things, from climate change to land use practices to infrastructure. And therefore the solution is unlikely to be agreed upon. So just recognizing that there's differences in opinion about ways in which to go about managing floods in the future in the watershed. And there's also a tension between who should be making decisions and where the resources should come from. So we generally like it when the state or federal government, when we can dip into their coffers, but we also like to make decisions on the ground locally. So there's kind of a tension between who has the resources and who should be making the decisions on the ground. And also residents hold a deep conservation ethic and sense of community that officials can leverage for collective action. So we saw that feeling like everyone kind of plays a role in flood management. And also if you think about, any second and surely third generation farmer in the region probably has a relative that participated or is acutely aware of the the first watershed demonstration project back in the early 20th century. So there's really this feeling that the Coon Creek watershed is a place where producers, residents can figure this stuff out, which is encouraging for future resilience. So I will now pass it over to Raj to talk about flood management institutions.
Thanks, Jackson. So moving on to a flood management institution group. The goal of this group was to understand and map the flood management institutional landscape, analyze the institutional landscape to locate obstacles for successful flood management, and to develop recommendations on how to improve these institutional relationships. So the institutions that govern flood management are manifold and complex. A few of the key institutions are listed on the screen, such as the DNR, NRCS, FEMA, and local municipalities. This is no way an exhaustive list. Costs and responsibilities are distributed across all levels of institutional actors, from individual to federal. Institutional mapping is used to help understand the existing distribution of power, and it focuses on the key actors and their interactions, where the power is located, who is able to influence the decisions, who makes the decisions, and the source of funding. Through this, we use the Institutional Analysis and Development, or IAD, framework to develop maps to conceptualize and articulate the components and interactions that together form flooding's institutional landscape. So on this slide, this is an example of one of the institutional maps that we developed. I won't go into too much detail right now, but this map looks at rebuilding floodplain structures. It is a complex system to navigate and is dependent on the DNR, FEMA, and local floodplain zoning. This map just highlights the complexities and barriers for local stakeholders. So next, Catherine will dive deeper into the discussion of this group.
Thanks, Raj. It was about 1.5 years ago that this group took our first trip to the watershed, and we immediately started hearing stories about how difficult it is to navigate flood assistance because of the complexities that that institutional map on the last slide visually implies. And because of this, we immediately identified flood management institutions as one of our research interests. And since then, through our research, it's been consistently reinforced that the complexity of flood management institutions and their institutional interactions are a barrier to success for flood resilience in the Coon Creek watershed. First off, as a rural region with a small population, the municipalities and counties that make up the watershed have access to limited funding, resources, and staff. The village of Coon Valley, a large municipality for the watershed, for example, has 4 employees. And simply having less capacity is a barrier to accessing future resources, especially the much needed state and federal programs and funding that could help build flood resilience. There's limited staff to write the grants, limited technicians to carry out the work. And we've heard multiple times through our interviews that landowners want to implement flood mitigation projects, but need technical or financial support. Sometimes they have their own funds. They just want help in successfully implementing a mitigation project. Additionally, challenges in the Coon Creek region are further complicated by interactions between different scales of government. Thanks, Raj. Our interviews revealed the idea that the local government is working really hard, but the federal agencies have the money, which exemplifies a barrier where county governments have identified goals for flood mitigation, but need more money and staff to fulfill that work. And this barrier to funding is especially important because being able to fund flood mitigation work now prevents more expensive spending and flood recovery later. The literature reinforced that flood management institutions are siloed into many agencies that were created with varied purposes and goals, and that it can be very difficult for counties and citizens to access resources through them. Importantly, each agency is a different avenue and has different requirements for accessing assistance. And also access differs at various stages of the flood management cycle. So there's mitigation, disaster, and recovery. As an example, county governments of Coon Creek have received federal assistance for flood management from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the USDA, FEMA, just to name some at the federal level. So local agencies with limited staff are keeping up with numerous applications and grants and assistance, each with their own protocols and regulations. Homeowners, landowners, business owners alike all also said that they all also interact with all levels of government and with a variety of agencies. And we heard numerous times that this is very confusing. In part, these agencies are siloed due to previous eras of flood management that grew into what exists now and could be improved through intergovernmental and interagency coordination. As Jackson noted before, unfortunately, people are often interacting with this complicated institutional landscape for the first time when they've been badly flooded. And it is confusing, and people might not know procedurally helpful information until too late. And we came to see that being flooded is in some way the best practice for how to navigate these institutions. And unfortunately, the local governments and residents are getting better at doing so through repetitive flooding. But clearly, people shouldn't have to learn such important matters by trial and error. Next slide, please. Thank you. So within this complex landscape, we understand that there is a role for all levels of government, but we see counties as best for emergency management. As compared to individual municipalities, counties have more technical, administrative, and financial capacity and are more closely tied to the state government, but are still close to the ground and can best understand local needs. But to make this full circle, these counties need more funding to do the heavy lifting that this job entails. So with these issues in mind, our paper recommends the creation of a joint powers board. And we know that this idea is in the works. The Coon Creek Cooperative Agreement is currently being discussed, and the involved parties are waiting for watershed study outcomes before moving forward in a formal manner. So this agreement is a cooperative governance structure through which the counties can more easily exercise their existing powers, but do so along the hydrological boundaries. As mentioned before, it's critical at this point in time for the various governments to communicate their perspectives and goals for flood mitigation and to pursue the work collaboratively. Villages may have different interests and concerns from one another, and collectively villages might have different weighted interests and concerns than some of the rural regions in the county. The legal mechanism of the Joint Powers Board states that the whole group can act together to the extent that the member with the least authority has. So it's most reasonable that the 3 counties are the legal members of this agreement. However, we recommend ample representation from a variety of people, agriculture, conservationists, public works, and industry. This Joint Powers Board could decide to exercise authority to a varying degree of magnitude. It could be as simple as education and outreach, or scaling up to collaborative work on zoning and targeted buyouts and land acquisition. Additionally, a cooperative management structure could pool resources. Collectively, having greater resources, greater capacity would allow for access to more funds in the future. Importantly, because the results of mitigation efforts are connected at the watershed scale, this could improve the coordination of flood-related efforts. Again, greater capacity allows for more funds, making this a solid idea. And our final research component is community resilience.
Thank you, Catherine. So I will be talking about community resilience, and the 3 goals of this section are to first understand the indicators of a resilient community and how communities in the Coon Creek watershed demonstrate resilience. Next, to analyze capacities and vulnerabilities of communities in the Coon Creek watershed to flooding in order to continue growing resiliency. And then lastly, develop recommendations based on these areas of vulnerability. So before we dove into our analysis of resilience of communities in the Coon Creek watershed, it was important for us to understand what community resilience was and why it was important. Twig provides us definition here. If we want to break that down, community resilience is the ability of a community to adapt, recover, and prepare for and from future disasters. So with this in mind, it is important to note that communities faced with these continual bouts of devastation, like Coon Creek experiences flooding, are essentially forced to develop certain resilient characteristics such as attitudes, preparedness and response strategies, policies, warning systems, among many others. Resilience as a community is important because it doesn't take into account just one preparedness strategy, it takes into account the whole system. It is a holistic perspective of preparedness, and this allows communities to effectively reduce their vulnerabilities and risk for future disaster. And so by understanding what factors are included in community resilience, it is possible to assess a community's resiliency through qualitative and quantitative indicators, which is what we did for these communities in the Coon Creek watershed. Thank you. In this analysis, we use the framework developed by John Twigg, Characteristics of a Disaster Resilient Community, to compare indicators or characteristics of resilient communities to those that we discovered through interviews, casual conversations, and research. So while there are many frameworks and scorecards that attempted to understand what creates a resilient community, we chose this framework because it was incredibly detailed. It had been used for empirical studies in communities that are relevant around the world, and it's based upon the only internationally agreed upon disaster reduction plan, the Sendai framework. So in this analysis, resilient characteristics are divided into 5 thematic areas. Each of these areas contain 3 to 7 components of resilience, and under each of these are 5 to 15 resilient characteristics in enabling environments. So it really just accordions out. And since it wasn't feasible for us to analyze each component and each characteristic, we chose 9 of these components with at least 1 of them from each thematic area. And when we identified some of the vulnerabilities and capacities that exist within the Coon Creek watershed, we compared these characteristics to the communities that we found. Next, please. So here are just a few of the capacities we found for communities in the Coon Creek watershed. Many of the themes that we found were related to the strength of connection and community that residents feel in the watershed. So as an example, each of these are some of the volunteers that helped out during and after the flood events. Another theme was that everyone understands that flooding will continue to happen and that it will potentially get worse. So adaptive practices have been ingrained in them, such as becoming flood aware or constantly keeping an eye on the weather. Vulnerabilities that we found ranged from a lack of communication before, during, and after flood events to land use management and practices that are changing, which is a potential cause of increased flooding, to a lack of staffing and funding. And many of these vulnerabilities are really a fault of circumstance, town size, change in farming practices generationally, the topography of the landscape, among many others. However, it's very important to give light to these vulnerabilities in order to foster resiliency. The rest of these capacities and vulnerabilities are listed in our report in full. So just on a separate note, you may have noticed that many of these vulnerabilities as well as capacities are ones that have already been mentioned previously in this presentation. This just drives home the point of needing to understand the holistic nature of community resilience. And next slide. Lastly, based on these vulnerabilities that we found within the communities of Coon Creek watershed, we've developed a set of recommendations and actions. The first of which is to promote targeted floodplain buyouts, which would maintain community in the area and in the watershed by encouraging residents to stay, as well as lowering the costs and risks for all. The next is to adopt early warning systems and two-way communication systems, which is currently in the works. They're setting up stream and weather monitoring stations specifically for this purpose. Next is to develop more comprehensive county emergency management websites, which could act as landing pads for these emergency action plans, climate data that's coming out, different resources for the community to access. And then lastly, to establish better communication practices between these 3 counties, which has already been recommended by the institutions group through this Joint Powers Board. And so with that, I'd really like to acknowledge the extensive amount of work that is already occurring in communities in the Coon Creek watershed, as well as in the counties and other organizations, levels of government that they're doing to increase flood resiliency. Especially with the amount of time invested, volunteer work during these crises, and the strong networks formed within the community. So there are two main takeaways that we would really like to reinforce with this presentation. The first is the need for greater amounts of perennial cover in the landscape, which has been shown through research will increase infiltration and may reduce the severity of flooding. And second is that in order to do many of these recommendations that we've recommended throughout the presentation for each group, there's a great need to support the local staffing through additional resources such as funding, technical assistance, people power, and many others. So all that to be said, the issue of flooding and resiliency in this region is an interdisciplinary one, and it requires multiple points of view, strong community support. And then lastly, I'd like to put in a plug for a presentation, our report that is forthcoming and will be accessible on our website listed here. And I think Eric just put that in the chat as well. So finally, I'd like to thank Monroe, La Crosse, and Vernon counties for supporting us through funding and access to resources. A special thanks to Dr. Eric Booth, our fearless leader throughout this whole extravaganza. And thank you to our technical advisory committee who have provided us with their expertise. Paul Juckham, Dr. Caroline Gottschalk-Drusky, Dr. Adina Rissman, and Dr. Steve Ventura. And then lastly, a special thanks to our contributors, Dr. Anita Thompson, Dr. Daniel Wright, Bob McKeel, Ben Wohan, Matt Hanawal, Tucker and Becky Gretebeck, Chris Peterson, Thomas Turco, and Steve Becker. And I'd also like to thank all of the people that we have interviewed and provided their opinions to us. So I think we can open the floor for questions.
Awesome. Please join me in virtual applause. I know it's always hard to do virtually, but thank you so much. So I'm gonna open up the floor to questions, and I think it's a small enough group that if you wanna unmute and go ahead and ask or raise your hand, but feel free to type in the chat. That might be a good way to do it too. I'll give maybe a little bit of time for people to think of their questions.
We also welcome comments or observations or your personal experiences.
Yes, absolutely. Anything particularly resonated?
I'll go first, Eric, if everybody's looking.
Go ahead, Tim.
Hey, Eric. For those who don't know me, I work in Congressman Ron Kine's office, and I want to thank all the students for doing this. You're kind of getting at a lot of the questions I've had about flooding and land use and resiliency that I've had for a while. And having been out amongst these floods for 15 years or so, this is a big thing to get your arms around. I thought you did a fantastic job of addressing a lot of these questions. So everybody gets an A, Eric.
That's already taken care of.
No, but so, you talked a lot about the, institutions and all the varied things that are the layers here involved with trying to deal with all this. And that's something that we have been really working hard on. So, the thought of a comprehensive type of body that can oversee a lot of this work. And, that's something we've been looking at very hard. So it seems to be happening kind of organically, but, that's something certainly of interest to us as we move forward. And of course, there's always the question of money. We're somewhat hopeful that, some of the funding for the COVID package that just got approved, for instance, and or a potential infrastructure bill that would come out can be broadly defined and maybe directed toward some of this kind of work. I know that communities and people living along these watersheds are kind of holding their breath right now because they're somewhat unprotected, and we know there's a lot of work to do. So, you know, I attended a lot of flood recovery meetings in a lot of communities in the last 5 to 10 years, and I know the thought occurred to me, we either need to improve the infrastructure here or help get people out of the way, or both, because we can't keep using, you know, FEMA money, for instance, to constantly recover from disaster. So we'd much rather take a proactive approach. It makes much more sense economically. So thank you again for the work, and we'll be using a lot of this information, I know, moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim.
This is Gillian Pomplin.
Hi, Gillian.
Hey, so, you know, I'm sort of, I guess, like Tim, I'm a little bit taken with this idea of a joint powers board. And, you know, I think that, you know, if Coon Creek were to develop a model in that vein, that could potentially be some level of a cookie cutter that would, you know, map over to other watersheds, because we all know that watersheds don't respect little dotted lines on maps that say the name of counties. But you know, I'm just not quite sure how that would work or what that would encompass. You know, it's obviously there's already governments, so how would that work?
Yeah, I think that my description of it was slightly vague on purpose because the legal mechanism means that the board together could perform any of the same authority that those individual counties do. So the same authority that a county has is what the board would have. However, how it's used is really a matter of the people involved. So I mentioned that it could be something as simple as collaborative education and outreach, or more complex things like targeted land buyouts. And again, I was vague in part intentionally because that would be a decision to be made by the counties themselves.
If I could just add on quick, I think an interesting model that maybe could apply elsewhere is the producer-led watershed model that's kind of in existence in the state already. The producer-led watershed model is a little bit more focused on non-point pollution, but that kind of aggregation of watershed boundaries as opposed to these hard-cut county lines, which often, if ever, line up with watershed boundaries, could be another kind of example to look at in a way to create a program that can apply elsewhere in the state.
Hey there, Bob McGill.
Yeah, go for it, Bob.
Congratulations, an awesome job to the students. Obviously, you've had a lot of obstacles to navigate to get your field work done and deal with communication with landowners and professionals. Great job. I thought the presentation and your outcomes were pretty spot on. Obviously pointing to some challenges as far as the conservationists and what we have to do. And I think one of them you led off with policies, and that's really one of the drivers. And what you see on the landscape is really a policy, whether it's federal or state, when you see conservation work disappear and it goes to row crops. So those are all challenges that we face. To suggest that, you know, it's hopefully this summer you can come back to the watershed as students and professors and people involved, and maybe we can host you and talk Greta Box into hosting you for a pizza again and we can celebrate your work and have a good discussion with the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I would add is the discussion on the Joint Powers Board. We do have a template kind of etched out between the 3 counties. We're waiting for the federal outcome with the structures on whether to close them, rebuild, or look at other options up within the watershed. So there's that financial component. But the whole purpose is to have a legal body, decision-making body within the watershed. It's not one county making a decision to remove a dam, which is ultimately going to affect the other counties. We all have to be sitting at the table when we make these critical decisions, because everybody's affected or impacted by these decisions. So again, it's that decision-making body. The financial end, obviously, if there's big ticket or dollars involved, we'll be going back to our county boards with that request, but the decision's got to be community-led within the watershed.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, Bob. So there's a question in the chat from Glenn Hoff on any plans to replace the dams which are now gone. And Bob kind of just mentioned that. And yeah, I won't, maybe someone from the project could talk about that.
Yeah, so there is an ongoing watershed planning project, the Plan EIS, going on for both Coon Creek and the West Fork Kickapoo. That's really looking to answer that question of what role dams will or will not play in watershed management, flood management in the future. I think our cohort here took a tack that was a little bit different, a different approach to watershed management, looking at land use, kind of the social component. But I would, if you're interested in the role of the Plan EIS and that discussion of the future of the dams, I would encourage you to check out the Plan EIS. I don't know if Eric, you want to throw that link in the chat. They have a website dedicated to that. So
yep, just put it in there. Great. Thanks, Jackson. So a couple other questions from Marcy. Great job. Is there a plan to promote the report / website in the area? Local community channel, UW website. Happy to help share it on the social media methods we use. Yeah, so that's kind of in development, and we've been working with the Nelson Institute communications team, and yes, we'd love to coordinate with some local outlets for sure. Keep you posted. And then Steve Becker asks, everyone supports upland watershed treatment to reduce the floodplain in the valleys. How would you establish upland watershed planning goals? And also, what percentage of the watershed land use needs to be converted to satisfy the constituency in the valleys? Who would like to take that one?
I could try and tackle that one. Yeah, I guess planning in terms of establishing the ridge versus the valley planning goals. I think that's obviously when we set forth this project and like deciding what wanting to look at focus on practices on the ridge, that's where the potential is for changes, right? Because in this watershed we have steep hill slopes, you can't really do too much there, and once it's in the floodplain you can't do much. But in terms of setting the goals, I think again, it's already in place. I think as we talked about, I think the watershed as a whole does have a pretty good practice and understanding of what needs to be done. And again, there is maybe some shortcomings with staffing or whatever in implementing those practices. But I think those goals are established pretty well and kind of working to implement practices, and I think it's just a matter of funding and whatnot. But in terms of what percent of the watershed needs to be converted to satisfy the valleys, I guess that's not something we specifically looked at, but I think it is a good question, saying how much, and something, I don't know, I know Steve, you're with NRCS, so I don't know what the planning IS is looking at in terms of that, but that is definitely something that would be helpful to consider, looking at if you get X amount of watershed practices in there. Is that gonna kind of modeling that out? So I know obviously the Plan EIS is doing some stuff with that. So I'm sure that's an important question to answer.
Yeah, it sounds like something the modeling can definitely help to answer potentially. Thanks, Robert. So great. This one's from Matt Hannawall at La Crosse County. Great work, students. Thank you. Any thoughts on creating new incentives, financial or other, directly related to conservation practices that increase organic matter and or promote infiltration?
Yeah, I guess I can talk a little bit about that one too. I guess like the current incentive programs, which we really didn't touch too much on in the project, but really like NRCS is a QUIP program, and then also DNR programs to help provide incentives to farmers. And those are, and I guess just on a broad scale, those are all voluntary. So those kind of incentives oftentimes require you filling out grants or the farmer filling out grants, and then it can get kind of backlogged just because it's a national system. So I think looking at other ways, and I think even like Jackson's farmer-led, like you mentioned, the producer-led watershed group, that is one kind of community-based program that you can do that, but also obviously any way to reform that system as well. Either, I know producer pays approaches are, it's a little more regulatory and it's requires a lot more policy and enforcement from the, I guess, DNR or other people, but I think there is a landscape for incentives right now. It's just, again, NRCS runs them, it's on a national scale, and it's oftentimes slow. And again, you get into the staffing and funding and all those related issues.
Great, thanks, Robert. So then Craig Hoff has a question. In 2007, Vernon County suffered a 1,000-year storm event. Do you know how the 2018 flood compares with the flood that year? I don't, and I don't know if anybody else wants to answer it. So I don't know specifically about that 2007 event, but I'm guessing it's, these storm events can be quite local. And so a 1,000-year event in one part of the county may not be quite as large in another part, but certainly 2007 and 2008 were big flood years in that region. So Coon Creek and the West Fork Kickapoo were kind of the epicenter for some of the 2018 flooding. And certainly that was the flood of record for those two watersheds.
I just want to hop in and take this opportunity to just clarify that kind of 100-year and 1,000-year event.
Yeah, go for it.
So we use those terms frequently when we think about a 100-year flood event. What that actually means is there's a 1% chance of that event occurring each year. So there can be some kind of confusion about that. If we got a 100-year flood event this year, then we won't have another one for 100 years. That's not exactly how it works. It's just a 1% chance of it occurring each year. That is a common, that came up in our interviews a lot as far as difficulty communicating about flood events to the public.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackson. Let's see, Paul has a comment. Yeah, he can connect to you. Love to talk more. Harry Friedman has got a list of questions. So 3 totally unrelated questions. 1, Catherine mentioned cooperative land management / ownership. Is there any precedent for this?
So yes, I would like to clarify that this is a legal agreement. So it's not so much ownership as it's a joint powers board, or in this case, it's titled the Coon Creek Cooperative Agreement. And these are simply collaborations between governments. And this would allow for the county governments to make decisions along the watershed boundary lines in ways that they currently can't. And there is precedence for this. Other states often have watershed boundary lines as cooperative agreement relationship. Just across the Mississippi in Minnesota, there are cooperative agreements along watershed boundaries, as an example.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Jackson mentioned not estimating the cost of the public of some of the practices discussed in the economics section. Do you have an estimate on the possible value to the public?
Yeah, so I think the best estimate would be the numbers that get sent up to FEMA for reimbursement. So I just looked it up quick, and then the 2018 event in Vernon County caused an estimated $209 million in damage. So that would be one way to think about that. The tricky part is understanding, kind of similar to what Steve Becker had asked earlier, how much do we have to invest in land management practices, dams, whatever it is, to reduce that public cost? And is that going to be cost effective? Trying to find that. I mean, it's almost impossible to say, if we have 1,000 more acres of contour strips, then we'll reduce our costs to public infrastructure by $2 million. I mean, it's also variable and ever changing. But yeah, I mean, the costs of the public are kind of an important consideration when we start thinking about public dollars. I mean, if a county, if the state, if the federal government could invest $1 million in a water management tool in the watershed, and it reduced public costs during a flood event by $5 million, that's good math right there. So trying to nail that down is a little bit tricky, but definitely an important part of considering public investment in particular.
Great, thanks. And yeah, that's definitely a question that is going to be a part of the plan EIS process and the different options that they're looking at after the dam breaches. So economics is going to fold into that project. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested to visit that website and check it out. So last question, Kayla spoke about the community resilience as a strength, possibly as an outcome of volunteers helping after flood events. Is this only among owners of land in the valley? Did this establish relationships between ridgetop and valley residents at all? Or if not, are there ways to better strengthen community between ridgetop and valley landowners?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really, really great question. So I honestly don't know if it's if the volunteers helping after a flood, if it was only established connections between landowners. We interviewed, I think it was six public members of the public, and 8 kind of managers in the area. So really that's not a comprehensive set of everyone in the area. So it's kind of hard to say. As for relationships between the ridgetop and the valley, it does seem like there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So I think ways to strengthen that, which we are going to mention in our report. One thing that could possibly be done is to create some sort of emergency organization in order to establish that connection and communication between the ridgetop and the valley landowners. And that's not to say that it's a problem everywhere between everyone. There may be some of these connections already formed, but it is something important to increase resilience, to establish those connections between those who are not experiencing flooding in such a severe way. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Kayla. So Glenn Hoff had a quick follow-up on the first part of that. So help came from all over. in his experience after the flood. So thanks for that. Was somebody else trying to jump in? So Alex Soderman, has there been any quantifiable change in the watershed hydrology from pre-flood to post-flood, especially in infiltration rates as a result of sediment remobilization in the valleys and erosion of the hill slopes? And related to that, are there particular locations that are more susceptible to erosion if another flood event of similar or larger magnitude occurs that should be targeted for erosion management?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think the big change, again, we didn't touch on it too much in the presentation, but I think gullies reforming might be the only big change to flooding or to hydrology from the floods. So those gullies could, again, kind of if you go back to time of concentration, reduce that time of concentration if the flood and from erosion and whatnot created gullies. So that's not something we really particularly looked at, but I guess what could be done is kind of if there were extensive gullies, and I don't think it's been like really looked at by that many people, kind of working to repair those and kind of block that flow down gullies would be one maybe change in hydrology. Particular locations susceptible to erosion, I guess. I don't know, again, that might go along with the gullies as well. Yeah, I don't know if Rachel or Eric, you guys have anything to add on that one?
I think the only thing I can think of in terms of like change in hydrology, I guess, is, or just thinking of the landscape in general too, is thinking of when we went out there, just seeing the amount of sediment that really flowed and really along the sides of the creek, and also just how much damage was done to the dams and kind of that erosion that occurred, and kind of, I think that might be another place that there might be a lot of erosion in the future, but I'm not super sure.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the gullies. I think that's certainly an open question, and if there was more time for field work last summer, I was gonna ask the students to kind of take some walks in some of the local gullies and see what they saw, because it's really hard to tell sometimes. Like they're just totally choked out and hard to observe unless you're actually walking through them. But we can try and look at some of those changes through LiDAR data, and kind of anxious to see maybe the next round of LiDAR from the counties that are able to detect those kind of changes in elevation, and maybe shows those gullies reactivating in some places. But yeah, part of me is like, maybe it wasn't a great idea because there's a ton of ticks in this area too. So, but it saved you guys.
Hello, everyone. This is Glenn Huff. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So one of the things you mentioned was an early warning system of some sort or whatever. I live 200 yards from the Coon Creek in Coon Valley, and I'm a little bit up on the hill, so I was not hurt at all. I slept through the whole thing. The next morning, I found out that our first responders and our volunteer fire department are absolutely amazing, and took care of a lot of people that night, a lot of people. And so I just want to say thank you to those folks for doing that. Thank you for just keeping this ball rolling. And the dams did do what they were supposed to do. They're supposed to hold what is it, 6 inches of rain over a 12-hour period or whatever. I don't know what the numbers are, but we had 14 inches. None of the dams should have held. So it worked. The system worked the way it was supposed to. It was a way up above and beyond. So thank you all for this. This is great.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Glenn. Yeah, certainly something that we've heard a lot of stories about, the heroism on that night and the following days.
Yeah, Eric, can you hear me? This is Steve Becker.
Yeah, go for it, Steve.
Yeah, I just wanted to
respond to the last gentleman with regard to, how would an early warning system work in a watershed that's so quick, right? I mean, by the time the storm starts, it's in the valleys. I mean, your students have walked those slopes. The upland watershed slopes are steep. The ravines are steeper, and so the NRCS has, we contracted with a firm to provide early warning for the 13,000 NRCS assisted dams in the United States, and it was called Dam Watch. And it actually is it's a system that's constantly on guard using the NexRad system of monitoring the stormwater, the rainfall potential in storm cells as they approach the watershed. The NexRad radar, they can actually detect, just like a weatherman predicts how many inches of rain we're going to get on Thursday night. This is constantly monitoring those storm cells, and when the pixels in those storm cells add up to a certain volume of water, it sends an email and text warning system to all of the state engineers regarding flash flood potential in those dams. So I think the answer to an early warning system is to try to predict the runoff, the rainfall potential before it shows up. The key is knowing how big the storm cell is and where it is relative to the area of the watershed, right? I mean, if the weatherman says that it's going to rain 1.5 inches on Thursday night, that's only marginally helpful because you don't really know where and to what extent. And that's where that Dam Watch program comes in, because it actually looks at the volume of rainfall projected over the top of the watershed, and if it's over a certain amount, it sends out a warning, an early warning. That's watershed specific. It's different than, National Weather Service warnings for a regional area.
And so what kind of coverage is there of that program, and is any of it publicly available, or is it all just sent?
Yeah, it is publicly available, and it also monitors magnitude and acceleration of earthquake activity. If you were in the western states, it monitors snowpack runoff potential. So it has some other warning triggers built into it. It was primarily set up for a transfer of inspection records and as-built drawings with regards to dams to successive watershed sponsors and their construction, or their dam inspectors. And then we built this warning system into it, and it's basically how the government computes on an average annual basis the benefits of the watershed program to Congress every year. It looks at, it does a calculation of potential runoff and flood reduction benefits. So it is available to the sponsors through the NRCS. It's just probably never been used this way. A lot of folks set up telemetry at the dam sites to monitor reservoirs, and when they get to a certain stage, it sends out a warning. But in watersheds like these that are so quick, I mean, the storm beats the message almost. So,
right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, certainly being able to transmit data on a minute or at least 5-minute basis is going to be pretty critical if you're depending on rain gauges in the region. But yeah, I like the idea of focusing on radar as well ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, to know within 48 hours of whether a storm cell has the mass and extent to drop runoff over that watershed to trigger a certain event.
Right.
To know that in 24 to 48 hours in advance would beat anything that you could put on the ground.
Right.
You know, a bunch of rain gauges scattered across the 90,000 acre watershed. To make any sense out of those rain gauges in a meaningful way, it'd be too late.
Yeah.
You know. Anyways, sorry.
Great. No, thank you. Thanks, Steve. Well, it is after 7 o'clock, and we will probably say goodbye at this point, but just wanted to thank you all again for joining us this evening. And thanks again to the 6 WRM students. Did a fantastic job. And please join me again in another round of virtual applause. I can put my hands together here. Thanks again.